from the US market, and hence the applicability of these trading strategies is best suited to stock markets in the US. A pertinent question, therefore, in this context is how relevant are these anomalies for other markets, especially India? A 2020 Journal of Finance paper by Jacobs and Mueller explores post-publication effects of not one, not two, 241 anomalies in the US in 38 international stock markets. They find that returns on these anomaly-based trading strategies do go down post-publication, but only in the US market. In the other markets, they persist quite well in 38 out of the 39 countries in their study, including India. Today's webinar will help us make sense of what exactly are these market anomalies and what are some of the challenges in the implementation of the anomaly-based trading strategy in the Indian market. May I now request our Chief Business Development Officer, Mr. Ravi Varanasi, to welcome us all and start today's session. Over to you, Ravi.
Thanks, Devshankar. Thank you very much for the introduction to this today's topic. Professor Ramana, Professor Nitin, Professor Prachi, Professor Prasanna, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to you all to this webinar on putting academic research to practice. In the last 25 years, NSE has emerged as the largest exchange in India, as well as among the top 3 exchanges in the world. NSE is the largest derivatives exchange. Last year, 2019, we have become the largest derivatives exchange in the world. NSE has achieved this feat through an electronic interface, which has tried and tested over the last 2.5 decades. The democratic investor access, which we were able to build by knitting together the entire country, and deployment of cutting-edge technologies. But beyond the traditional mandate of providing world-class trading infrastructure for all asset classes and managing the market quality, which is obviously critical for us, NSE encourages continuous dialogue among regulators, practitioners, and academia on policies through its research collaborations with top-notch global as well as domestic institutions. That's critical for us. We believe empirical evidence-based policy would really take the markets forward. The research initiatives which we have enabled over the period have kind of spanned across diverse fields, such as corporate governance, empirical finance, securities markets, and market microstructure, which is again critical for us in terms of devising our approaches to managing the markets efficiently. So we have a significant interest in that area, and these findings from these research initiatives are widely discussed. We always try to disseminate these findings of this research through a multi-channel approach which we take, panel discussions, conferences. We use media, social media. Plus, we have our flagship NSE publication, which is called the Market Pulse, through which we try and reach out to the largest section of population, investing community particularly. One of the initiatives which we have done in 2014 is to collaborate with ISB to set up NSE ISB Trading Lab. The Trading Lab has been a success and has encouraged research and dialogue in policy dialogue in various fields like security trading, investments, and financial markets. The Trading Lab is at the forefront of cutting-edge research in unexplored avenues in capital markets, corporate finance, asset pricing. A lot of research has come out of the Trading Lab. Close to about 25 high-quality papers have been published over the years. Some of these research papers have gone into top-notch international journals. Research findings from the Trading Lab are also integrated into the existing educational courses offered by ISB, the training programs, online programs, internship programs, etc. Some of the research results we also used in actually devising part of our regulatory as well as market quality approaches, both in terms of devising the right kind of policies in these areas. We're actually further strengthening our academic outreach by streamlining researchers' access to data by setting up a data room, about which you'll be hearing soon from us. Today's webinar is also one of the many initiatives carried out by NSE ISP Trading Lab. Today's panel consists of some of the best researchers in the area of Indian financial markets. I'm sure they will share their knowledge and experience, and that should be of great help to all of us in understanding this particular area, which has been picked up for today's discussion. On behalf of NSE, once again, I welcome all of you for this webinar, and hope you'll find it useful and insightful as we go forward. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ravi. And without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me just introduce quickly the panelists. We have Professor Nitin Kumar, Assistant Professor in Finance. We have Professor Ramana Sonti, Clinical Associate Professor, Finance. We have Professor Prachi Devskar, Assistant Professor, Finance. And we have Professor Prasanna Tantri. He's going to be the moderator of the day's session. And he's an Assistant Professor and also the Executive Director of the Center for Analytical Finance at ISB. So Prasanna, over to you, please.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Tirthankar. Thanks, Ravi, for talking about the lab. But for your support, we wouldn't have had this lab. Now it's a time that we show some output from the lab, and this is one step in that direction. As Ravi said, NSE has been very supportive of academic research, and they recognize the best thing about NSE compared to other people who support research. They understand that these things have a long gestation period. At times takes some rigorous research takes a lot of time. So let me come to the topic of the day. So we are going to talk about putting academic research to practical use. That's the topic that we are going to talk about. Now, many of you, in practical context, when the word academic is used in a sort of sense to refer to things which are not practical, situations where the things that work only in an ideal world, where someone has put a lot of mathematics into data and try to show something. Today we will understand whether that notion is correct, or can we make something of use out of academic research. One caution though, although we'll keep using this makes money, trading strategies, so on and so forth. This is not a kind of advertisement of any strategy or a suggestion that you should go out and try a specific strategy tomorrow. This is more of an introduction to a new area for a lot of people who have not seen academic papers, a new area that can generate a lot of ideas, and more importantly, a new approach to research. So as Tirthankar mentioned, as Ravi said, I have a panel of top finance researchers in India. When I say I mean these are top finance researchers. I'll give you some numbers to justify. These people publish in finance journals where acceptance rate is 6%. And these papers take 4 to 5 years. And in India, I don't think there are more than a dozen people, even that may be an exaggeration, who actively publish in these journals. So these are not any random international journals. These people publish in the top journals where people from Harvard or other schools aim to publish. So with this quick introduction, I'll just lay out the plan for the discussion for next 35-40 minutes. I'm going to ask about all the panelists about general views about how to use academic research in practice. Then I'll try to I'll request them to talk about findings from their own research. Then this is what Ravi was talking about. And then finally, we will also talk about what are the key takeaways and how, as a lay investor, I can use these insights in real life. So this is the plan. So let me start with Professor Prachi. So Professor Prachi, I just told you the notion about academic research that prevails. I'm sure you also would have heard this, in many places. Is this true that most of this academic research is mathematics, which you cannot use in day-to-day life? It can work only in an idealized situation, or is there something that we can learn from academic research, and how different is from an Excel sheet-based approach or an opinion piece and things like that we encounter in a day-to-day life?
Thank you very much, Prasanna. And first of all, thank you very much, NSE and Center for Analytical Finance at ISB for putting together this very exciting webinar. Okay. So coming to your question, Prasanna. Okay. So is it true that academic research is only for the bookish people and has no relevance in practice? This is not true at all, and particularly for research about financial markets. Yes. Financial market research aims to take into account all the practicalities of actually trading in a financial market, and at the same time, it aims to be rigorous. So it aims to be of practical use, at the same time reliable. Now, why it is more reliable than just an opinion based on a few observations? Okay. So in my mind, there are kind of at least three differences that this kind of casual opinion-based approach based on a few observations suffers from. Okay. So the first thing is selective memory. Okay. When we are just observing things casually and not recording them systematically, we tend to remember things that we like and forget things that we don't like or that suit our viewpoint. Okay. So for example, some students asked me, okay, a friend of mine invested in Yes Bank when it was 6 rupees and now it is 3 times that. Okay. So clearly my friend knows how to invest. Okay. Well, my question to that student is, well, how often has your friend invested? And how many times he has gained returns this? How many other friends you have who trade in the market? Okay. So the point is, this one selected observation will lead to very misleading conclusion, which we are prone to if we don't do rigorous work. Okay. The second problem of the casual approach is that you can't really tell if something is a random event or really a systematic factor. Okay. And this is where academic research helps to kind of distinguish between something that is not useful information versus something that is useful information. Okay. So a priori theory comes into play. Let's say from insights from psychology, we know that investors tend to have certain biases. And then if we test it rigorously, we are more confident that this is truly useful rather than just effect of data mining. Okay. And third thing, the casual approach can suffer from is hindsight bias. Okay. We only tend to look at things that have worked, but failed to take into account things that have not worked and hence would have lost money in the first place. Okay. So I think in this way, Prasanna, in my opinion, academic research has significant value over a casual approach to investing.
Yeah, so we understand. So the basically saliency bias and people suffer, don't look at the denominator, just look at numerator, and that happens in a lot of opinion pieces. Before I move on to Professor Ramana, will you give us one example of some anomaly, because Tirthankar started talking about anomaly, where all these have been applied and how it works, at least in the context of that paper?
Yeah. So one example of an anomaly, and again, Tirthankar explained it very well. Anomaly is basically something that it should not have been there, but the pattern is there, and we can use it to make return. Okay. So one such example is an anomaly called post-earnings announcement drift, or also called earnings-based momentum. Okay. The idea is very simple, that stocks that report better than expected earnings, of course, they do well at the time of the earnings numbers are announced. But what this anomaly documents is that over the next few months, these positive returns continue. Okay. And likewise, systematically, stocks that announce worse than expected earnings have worse return on that day, but then also continue to do poorly over next few months. Okay? Now, you can measure this in different ways. You can have sort of a previous financial statement based expectations, or you can look at analyst forecast of earnings and compare the actual numbers to that. Or you can also look at whether the market treated it as a good news on the earnings announcement time. Okay. So if the earnings announcement returns are positive, then the strategy says you should buy those stocks and hold them for next few months. And earnings, if there was a negative returns on earnings announcement day, then you should stay away from those stocks. Okay. And more than 3 decades of research has gone into looking at this anomaly. And when it was first documented, this was, of course, in the US context when it was first documented. The first documented, the results were very strong. And as now more people are trading on it in the US, the effect is still there, but the magnitude is smaller. Okay? But as Tirthankar pointed out in his opening remark, just because it has stopped working in the US doesn't mean it has stopped working around the globe. Okay? And this is a very, very strong anomaly that is seen internationally as well.
Thanks for that. One danger, some practitioner or someone who trades should not say that, no, I know IndusInd Bank, it reports excellent set of numbers, but after that it doesn't go up, it usually falls. These are exceptions, again, not to fall into this trap that I know that one particular stock that doesn't follow what Professor Prachi said, so all that she says is wrong. Again, if you want to really test, you have to go back and do the kind of follow the method that what she suggested. Let me move on to Professor Ramana. You are the one who introduced us to the world of anomalies. So let me take from where Professor Prachi left. She said that these things sometimes don't work in the US, but work in other countries. Can you throw some light on what's so different about US and in India? What is the reason that there is more promise for working on this in India than in the US? And also, if you can explain one or two anomalies that you taught us, that will be of use to everyone.
Okay, so first of all, good evening, everyone. Thanks, NSE, thanks, CAF, for this great opportunity to come in front of a bunch of very interesting people to talk about theory meeting practice. I think more is needed on this, and I'm so glad NSE and ISB are collaborating on this. Now, I also want to clarify when Prasanna says you're the one who introduced us to anomalies, he's speaking only for students, and it so happens he was a student in my class. He's not speaking for my other colleagues who are excellent researchers in their own right without any help from me. I just need to clarify that because lest I be misunderstood for some sort of a god, which I am not. So, all right. So, speaking about anomalies, first thing I want to clarify is this whole idea of anomaly. What is an anomaly? It is something that goes against the grain of established knowledge or established theory. So when something that should not be, as Professor Prachi put it, it should not be according to what we believe it should be. Now, what we believe could be wrong, first of all. And as academics, we should be humble enough to acknowledge that our existing paradigm itself may be wrong. In fact, if we stay very arrogant to our existing paradigms, knowledge would not move further, right? And history is replete with evidence where paradigms have come and paradigms have gone. So ultimately, like Prasanna was saying, research is rigorous, but it is a continuous process of trying to understand our world. So only in that context, there is a certain established theory of finance which we take as received and sometimes contribute, which is the state of the art. Now, these anomalies, which, for example, Prachi was talking about post-earnings announcement drift, and there are some others like this, which seem puzzling, and these are puzzles, really. And puzzles with respect to what we already think of as established knowledge, because we don't know why they should be. Now, one example that comes to mind for a long, long time ago when I was working on my PhD, and I won't tell you which year because it'll betray my age, worked on something called long-term, for example, underperformance of public issues. So this is a very simple idea. Lots of people know in this audience clearly the underpricing of IPOs at the time of the IPO, which is basically saying that the offer price happens to be less than, on average, the first day's market price, right? End of first day trading price. Now that's the well-known underpricing phenomenon. Now the academics before me had gone on to sort of examine samples of IPOs, that is initial public offerings, and SEOs, or seasoned equity offerings in the US or secondary offerings in India, and found that what happens after, fine, there is perhaps on average an underpricing, and there is strong evidence to that effect over the first day or the initial short run following the issue. But what happens in the long run? So people sort of tracked portfolios of IPOs or SEOs relative to their listing date and found really that over 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, in the really long run, let's say 3 years down the line after IPO, the average IPO or the average SEO seems to underperform. Now, what does underperform relative to? Underperform relative to a portfolio which is benchmarked to this portfolio carefully, to this IPO or SEO portfolio carefully meaning size, book to market, industry, certain characteristics used to benchmark precisely. And so the horse race is between portfolio 1, which has an issue, and portfolio 2, which doesn't have an issue but shares similar characteristics. And it turns out relative to the benchmark portfolio, our IPO SEO portfolio underperforms. Now that was the research before I was a PhD student. And eventually, sort of one of the questions I wanted to ask was, so if on average IPOs and SEOs are bad news, clearly we can do a test certainly in the SEOs, because this company, obviously in a secondary, the company has been trading, it has a history. So some mutual funds, for example, would have, institutional investors would have holdings in these companies which are going for an SEO. And on average, if they have read the Journal of Finance and they know that these firms are going to underperform in the next 3 years or 5 years, maybe they should dump it around the time they're holding in that SEO firm around the SEO. The moment an SEO is announced, or even in the days after, they should. Certainly, we have quarterly data to measure that. And what we actually find is two things. One is, for example, 40% of SEOs, although the average is bad news, 40% of SEOs actually go on to outperform their benchmarks in the next 3-5 years. So first of all, this average statement itself can be misleading. And that's where the academics are particularly, careful in looking at this and not just using that as a general trading rule. The second thing I noticed, to cut short a little bit, is that fund managers, right, en masse, or in total, when they increased their stakes around the SEO in an SEO firm, these are precisely the firms that tend to outperform going forward. And we do all sorts of tests to rule out whether it is buying pressure by these funds. Is it a short run thing? Is it a transient? Does it last longer? Well, it seems like, although I don't know why, and I think I can speculate why, these SEOs in which fund managers, for example, invest, go on to outperform, meaning that these guys are smart, actually. So that restored my faith, for example, in fund managers, right? Because in my typical finance textbook, I was told that the market is so efficient that it is a completely thankless, or actually certainly not thankless, but useless endeavor to try and make money. So, that's one example of where you can take an anomaly and sort of work your way through into something that may be of practical use to somebody who wants to put in the work to invest. Last thing I'll say, Prasanna, is although I say this, now it's very important that we don't take a theory paper, take the title in the abstract and say, hey, I got myself a trading rule. I think that would be a very, very wrong-headed approach. So one has to remember that there is a certain context to every paper that is written. And so one has to sort of do your due diligence, even on a trading rule, as long as it is given by somebody else. Remember, if you don't know why you're making money, then you should be afraid. More afraid than if you're not making money and you've given up, right? You should be really afraid if you're winning and you don't know why. That would be my caution in reading into theory. But I encourage people to definitely do that more often. Thanks, Prasanna.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. You should be worried when you don't know why you're making money. You know, that's I think a very important statement. I'll come to you again to understand how one should use this. Let me move on to Professor Nitin. So since we've already started talking about our research that panelists have done. So Professor Nitin is an expert in the area of mutual funds. So I have two specific questions. One is his general view about mutual fund investing in international markets versus India. And secondly, if he can throw some light on his fascinating paper where he and his co-authors have come out with a very different way of benchmarking. They find that the way we generally benchmark with some static index is not the right way of comparing mutual funds. So what is that approach and how it is useful for capital market participants? So this is like a end of first round, start of second round, and you do both, Professor.
Okay. Thanks, Prasanna, and thanks NSE and organizers for this great panel discussion. So I will first talk about a little bit about how the US industry has evolved, what's happening over there over a period of time, and about my experiences when I moved back to India after PhD in 2013, armed with knowledge gained over a period of 6-7 years during my PhD, how I started investing and how my thinking has evolved, how my research has evolved. I have prepared a couple of slides. I'm hoping we can have them online. Yeah. So this is from a paper by my advisor, Russ Vermers, and his co-authors, False Discoveries in Mutual Fund Performance Measuring and Estimated Alphas. It was published in JF, Journal of Finance, in 2010. And I was a PhD student at University of Maryland at that point. I read this paper and it fascinated me. And this is how I started working in the field of mutual funds. So what we have here is, on the x-axis, basically the timeline, how the number of funds in the US have grown starting from 1989 to 2006. I presume this this study has, because it was published in JF in 2010, so it was likely submitted to JF in 2007, and that is why the data ends in 2006. So we have the number of funds going up from like about 400 in 1989 to 1,800 funds or so. And if we see the average alpha, like the fund returns with respect to some benchmark, the average alpha has been coming down, and it's almost close to zero by 2006 or so. And this actually fascinated me, and I was armed with this knowledge, and building on what Ramana mentioned, that markets are efficient, and it kind of all made sense. I then came to India in 2013, and I started investing in index funds, and because the active funds don't outperform the index funds. But later on, then I realized that a lot of active funds in India, they actually do well, and this propelled my research in another direction. Why? So what is happening? So in US, the funds are their alpha is close to zero, but in India, there are some funds which are which can outperform the market. So I started looking into this area, and which propelled me in the direction of mutual fund competition. So I worked on this area in the mutual fund competition area. So I started analyzing the US market first over there, and then I and my co-authors came up with a measure through which we can measure the competition of active mutual funds like the. So if active mutual fund has some exposure to size and value orientation in the standard 3x3 matrix, then we figured out that there is a way to actually quantify the competition around mutual funds. If you can move back to the slide previous to this, I think it will be, yeah. So on the right-hand side, we have this fund X. This is just an illustrative example, which is in green, which is surrounded by some 5 funds over here. And we can pinpoint the location of funds in this 2-dimensional size and value growth orientation. And we can figure out how crowded investments are or investment locations are of various funds. So we were able to quantify the mutual fund competition, and we then examined whether funds, even in the US, funds that are operating in a lower crowded space, can they do better? And our answer was yes, and we were very surprised. However, it made intuitive sense. Like if you are operating in a less crowded space, there is less arbitrage capital over there, and funds can sustain their alpha in low crowded space as well. So that is one area which fascinated me over a period of time. Second point Prasanna mentioned is about benchmarking. And this is also from the same study. So on the left-hand side, you see a traditional way of benchmarking. You have size on the x-axis, value on the y-axis, and there is a 3x3 grid over there. We place the funds over there, and funds within the box are competitors of each other. In the process, when we were quantifying mutual fund competition, we also observed that this old technology, which started in post publication of the famous Pharma and French 1992 paper, where they show that size and value capture most of the return variation, most of the returns that are associated with the other different patterns in the data. And then the fund rating agency started benchmarking funds along these size and value dimensions. However, in the process, we found that this is a very noisy sort of a measure. So on the left side of figure, we have 2 red dots, which are the same funds in the same box. However, if we look at the proximate funds around these red dots, we find that there is some overlap from the box below it, and if we look at the red dot, the upper red dot, we find that the proximate funds are actually coming from the upper box. And then we started benchmarking funds using other active funds, but which are much more proximate to the investment locations of the fund, and that gives us a much better measure of ex ante outperformance potential of some funds. So 2 main outcomes of our research was, we were able to benchmark funds in a much better way. So if we look at the figure on the right side, and if we look at all the green fund and all the yellow funds, if they are in the same box, they will be considered peers of each other. However, if we look at fund X, we can figure out what are the proximate funds which are operating in the same investment space, and we can extract ex ante signal of potential outperformance of fund, which we call in our paper as customized peer alpha. So these were the 2 main findings of my paper, and our customized benchmarking is an improved version of traditional benchmarking that has been there in the fund industry in the US markets and other international markets for more than 25 years now.
So if I quickly summarize, what you're saying is, instead of blindly following past performance, which is what a lot of people do when investing in mutual funds, there is a different way of looking at things. One, look for a non-crowded space. That's where you may get higher return. And secondly, this way of just comparing with passive benchmarks may not be the right way of doing things.
Yeah, exactly.
Quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
If I'm not a fund house, let's say I own a brokerage, I have some PMS, I want to evaluate some hedge funds. Can your methodology be used there as well?
Yeah, so it can be applied to other kind of investments as well. We worked on mutual funds because we need a longer history. So the hedge fund data is not as granular, and it's not, it doesn't go all the way back. So for the mutual fund case, our data went all the way back to 1980. So we have about 30 years of data over there to actually validate our hypothesis. However, in the case of hedge funds, such an idea can be validated in future if we have granular enough data and going back in history. But in principle, it can be applied to those kind of investments as well. Yes, you are absolutely correct about that.
Okay, so that's great. So viewers, just to tell you, we are talking about trading strategies from academic research, and we are talking to people who have created them. So that's something that we have to keep in mind here. So let me move on with another idea that has come from research from people here. This is a joint paper of Prachi and Nitin with another co-author of theirs. So they're talking about, Prachi, if you can tell us something about that. When I read your paper, it said that if there is a lot of borrowing capacity, before reading it fully, I thought it's a good news. If there's a lot of borrowing capacity, that means when required, people will be able to borrow and then they'll make money. So, but you say it's a bad news. So why is having a lot of borrowing capacity among traders is a bad news, and how can one use it?
Yeah. Before answering this specific question, kind of let me step back and explain the context for this this question, right? So the holy grail, so to speak, of trading strategies is market timing strategies, okay? To figure out when Nifty 50 is going to go up and when it's going to go down, and basically go in just before it goes up and exit just before it goes down. Okay. Now this sounds almost magical, and it is. This is a very, very hard problem. And a lot of researchers have shown that most things that we might think will work don't actually work on a consistent basis. Okay. But at the same time, if you are able to predict even a little bit, you don't have to be right all the time. Okay. If you are able to do better than a coin flip, so to speak, then there is value to this approach. Okay. So this is where our paper comes in. And again, as Prasanna mentioned, this is joint work with Nitin and Jeremiah Poland, who used to be a student at ISB. So the idea is this, right? So different people in the market kind of have different opinions, can get different information, and use that for their own trading strategy. Okay? Now, a single person's information may not be very precise, may be very noisy. Okay? But if we can aggregate across not everybody, but sophisticated investors, then that turns out to be very powerful information. Okay. So the first part of our paper is that, can we aggregate the trading positions, trading direction of sophisticated investors? Okay. Now we look at traders who use margin to trade, and people here would know very well about margin. So you basically borrow, and if you have 1,000 rupees, you borrow some more and invest more than 1,000 rupees. Okay. Now, not all investors will use margin. Okay. Those, first of all, you need certain sophistication to understand how it works. Second of all, you need greater conviction to say that I'm willing to borrow and put my money, more than my own money, into this, because all losses are your own because you are committed to repay the full amount that you have borrowed. Okay. So our second point is that looking at traders who trade on margin is the right subset of investors to look at. Okay. Now let me come to your question. Why is excess capacity a bad signal? So the idea is this. Okay. So investors who trade on the margin, of course, cannot borrow unlimited amounts. Okay, there are regulations, there are risk management practices that are in place. So based on the value of your investment, you can only borrow a certain amount. So let's say 50% of your own money, or 50% of the value of the investment. Okay, so 50% is your equity, and you can borrow additional 50% same amount. And so if you are fully convinced that a particular stock or market in general is going to do well, then you will utilize this borrowing capacity, you meaning the trader who is trading on margin, will utilize this capacity, borrowing capacity, to the fullest possible extent. Okay. So if you can borrow 500 rupees, you will borrow 500 and put that into the market. Okay. But when such traders decide to borrow not fully 500, but let's say only 300, this is where we say that there is excess borrowing capacity. Okay. They could have borrowed 300, but they have not used 200 of that capacity. Okay. Now, why have they not used? Because they are not so convinced about putting money fully into this. Okay. And so that buffer indicates that they're being cautious, they're being conservative, they're not going in fully. And so what we argue and find that larger is this buffer, looking at all margin traders across the market, larger is this buffer, lower are future returns on the market index. Okay? And this turns out to be a very powerful signal about how the index is going to perform over next month. And this idea, I think, is applicable more broadly. Now, this particular paper is based on US data. Again, as Nitin mentioned, we wanted to have a long time series to rigorously test whether the strategy actually works. But the same principles can be applied to Indian markets as well, because the margin trading works in similar way in India as well. But more broadly, the idea that you can extract signals by aggregating behavior of sophisticated investors has been shown in other contexts as well, like short traders.
Yeah, so this is similar to what Professor Ramana just mentioned in SEO, secondary issues, sophisticated investors you have to track. Before I come to Professor Ramana, Professor Nitin, quickly, if you can tell us, with that strategy, is there something that we can learn about the macro economy as well? Is it just about trading, or does it give you some indicators about where the economy is going?
Yeah, so we examined this issue as well in the paper. And it so happens that it also gives you fair amount of indication about the macroeconomic variables as well. So we examined a bunch of variables, what happens to the earnings growth in future. So we find that, it's negatively related over there, which means that, these sophisticated investors, as Prachi just mentioned, their ex ante views turn out to be correct ex post as well. So yes, it can be used for other macroeconomic indicators as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So just a clarification: ex ante is before the fact, and ex post is after the fact.
Yeah.
So this.
Prasanna, I just want to add one point following Nitin's comment. This is exactly what Ramana was saying earlier, that that profound statement that if you are making money and you don't know why you are making money, you should be worried. Okay?
Yeah.
This is exactly the reason we did this analysis in the paper, to see what is the underlying mechanism. And that gives us greater confidence. The fact that this excess borrowing capacity can predict all kinds of things at the aggregate economy level gives us greater confidence in the trading strategy.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned the rational viewers, again an example of why it's not just a data mining exercise. There is a theory, there is a hypothesis, there are two possibilities, and then researchers go out and test it. Now, coming to Professor Ramana, now as a lay investor, how do I use all these things? So should I pay borrow a heavy education loan like I did to attend your class, or do you give private tuitions, or how do I get into these things? Is there a reasonable way?
Yeah, so you caught me there. So I'm going to wing it and give you what I think is a very honest answer. So, well, honestly, I mean, I'm sitting in an ISB office. I will invite all right thinking and smart people to come and do an MBA here. I mean, otherwise, I would not be doing justice to my employer. And we do a good job, as you know. And you are seeing the proof right here, the audience. I mean, here is a alumnus from our own school. Today is my colleague, and very soon I'm told he'll be my boss, and so who knows. So my point is, this is a good place. But getting away from that idea of ISB, or for that matter, even doing an MBA, right? I understand that people, for various reasons, may or may not want to do it, even if they had the means to. For example, they may not want to. Now, so one thing I have learned is, so read a lot is a big advice I give to a lot of people. Okay, so you can't start on Monday and say, I want to make money by Thursday. I mean, that, in the market or anywhere, right? So I may sound like like your favorite uncle in your family, but the fact of the matter is, there's a lot you can learn just by reading the financial press and trying to connect what you hear from even a basic textbook in finance. So basic text will tell you what is the state of the art, and you have to constantly learn to question. I think a lot of the time, and this is not an indictment of anybody, it's just the way we are. As we grow up, while being educated, we are taught not to ask questions. And the number of times I've been told by my school teacher, shut up and listen, is not funny. So I think we should not shut up, and we should not necessarily listen because Ramana or Prasanna is saying. We should learn to read and question. So can I give an example here, Prasanna?
Yeah, sure.
So one example is, like, you can be more intelligent consumers of the news. You don't need a fancy MBA for that. So, for example, some of you will remember many financial press articles came out in real time in the month of September, and then later followed up in October, that there was this massive options trade that was going on in the NASDAQ, and they called it the NASDAQ whale because it was unknown who was placing this 50 billion, that's with a B, dollar bet in the options market on the so-called FANG stocks, right? All this Facebook, Apple, Alphabet, etc. And there was at the same time, there was a rally in the stocks in the stock market. Now, we have to understand there are two different markets. One is the options and one is the stock market. And of course, many leading financial dailies and weeklies connected the two and said, this options bet is leading to a huge rally in the stock market in these stocks. And of course, everybody and their brother bought that story and printed and reprinted and reprinted. When I look at a story like that, I'm not a genius. I'm just trying to understand how can a $50 billion bet in the options market lead to a movement without any fundamentals in forget FANG, just Apple itself is $1.5+ trillion in market cap. So how can that bet lead to a pressure here? It was unclear to me. So my point is, I was only trying to be not even intelligent. I was just trying to connect what I read in my newspaper to what I read in my textbook. I think that skill is very underrated to me, Prasanna. I mean, I think, and this doesn't need a fancy MBA or a Harvard MBA or an ISB MBA, right? You just have to have your ears open, your eyes open, and look for stories, right? And say, can I make sense of this? And does this logically follow from point A to B? I think lots of times you'll find that lots of the so-called news, and I'm not blaming the press out here. I'm just saying, like, a lot of the stuff you hear and see may or may not make sense from a theory point of view. I'm using theory in a very guarded way. I'm not saying fancy theory from received knowledge point of view. So I would strongly urge everyone, irrespective of what profession they might be in, etc., to start making these connections between what we read about the world around us and what we read in our textbooks and what our teachers tell us. If you put them together and think deeply and spend time on a daily basis, this is like meditation. You have to do this practice. It won't come suddenly on Monday. And, successful examples of people who have done that are before you, whether it is Nitin or Prachi or, of course, Prasanna, right? So I think that doesn't, I will be humble enough, that doesn't need a PhD, Prasanna.
Yeah.
You just have to have the right attitude and a reasonably, functional brain, and which all our audience has. So I don't see why. So I'm not arrogant enough to say only we, the PhDs, can do it. No, everybody can do it if you just set your mind to it. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, Professor Nitin, we have like 3 minutes left.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of
I
questions.
went on too long.
No, that's fine. That is useful. Suppose I pick your margin paper that Professor Prachi discussed, and I don't know too much of mathematics, too much of finance. I have basic understanding. I trade. How should I read through the entire paper to put it to use, or can I get into some part of it where reading of which is enough for me to start trying with data?
Yeah. So normally when I read a paper, I have some sort of objective in mind. So I have rarely read a paper. Of course, during PhD days, I used to read like complete papers, but these days I have some sort of a objective in mind that I want to understand this part and that part and so on. So yes, it's not required that if you are looking for the trading idea based on our paper, it's not required to read the entire paper. So a lot of the paper gets into the why of it, why does it work, and so on. So if you want to get those kind of details, it's fine. Otherwise, normally the first 4 or 5 pages of the paper where in the introduction you have neatly laid down the idea. To get the idea, I think that much is enough. Now, you want to go a little bit beyond that and see what kind of data is used over there. And you can look at the sources of the data. And if you have access to professional data, that's good. If the data uses the open source data. So for our paper, we use open source data from the NSE website. So it's available over there. The market returns are available online. So a lot of it can be done just by skimming through the first 4 or 5 pages of the paper and looking at how the data has been used. So you don't really have to go through the entire paper, have clarity of your objective, what you're trying to achieve, and accordingly you can just go through some sections of the paper. But going through the introduction, I would say, is important.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a minute left. Professor Prachi, is there a role for someone like us, Center for Analytical Finance or NSE? Because Dr. Tirthankar started talking about Market Pulse that they publish. This is what Professor Raman also alluded to when we were talking. So is there a role for us to make these things simpler, publish? Should we, NSE and people like us, work together? Do you think that will be useful?
I think that is an excellent idea, Prasanna. And what can work is, for example, for popular or well-established papers in financial markets, NSE and CAF can kind of work together to produce, let's say, 5-page summaries, white papers of those. And I think that would kind of add excellently. Another issue here another initiative actually here I want to point out is, many of the research papers that we talked about are primarily in the US market. And a lot more work needs to be done for Indian financial market. What are specifically works in Indian market and Indian context? And in this regard, one of the many initiatives that NSE has is this excellent initiative jointly with NYU Stern, which happens to be my alma mater. So NSE NYU Stern initiative to study Indian financial market has done excellent job over last 7-8 years to encourage rigorous research on Indian financial markets. And so another thing that NSE and CAF can do to sort of other such studies, and some of them could be also replication of some effects that are documented in other international markets for Indian markets.
Which means Dr. Tirthankar and Ravi can give us more money.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thanks a lot. We are the first round, 45 minutes are up. The floor is open for questions. Anand, our head of research for CAF, will manage the questions. Anand, have you collected any questions for this? So anyone?
Yes, we have around 10 to 12 minutes for the Q&A. So if you have any specific questions which you want to ask, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A. Professor Tirthankar, Dr. Tirthankar, you can also go through the questions and let us know which are worth picking up.
Oh no, Anand, may I? There are a couple of questions already.
Sure, please go ahead.
You could go through them. By the way, before the Q&A starts, if I may take the opportunity, what Prachi, Prasanna, you said was music to my ears. No doubt about that, and we are truly happy. And both of your suggestions, Prachi, on making this rich body of research, these rich set of insights accessible to a wider public would be truly our goal. And if we are able to take this a little forward, I think the entire purpose of our engagement would have been served. So we are truly very thankful and grateful for all that has been done. And from what I've seen in discussions, we have learned a lot. And let me stop here. Anand, please go ahead with the questions.
Sure. So I just want to repeat once more before I go on with the questions. You can post your questions in the Q&A, and if you want to ask it to a specific professor, please name the professor as well. So let's start with the first question, and either of the panelists, please feel free to take this up. So there's a question which says, from the viewpoint of climate risk information, example, natural disaster, climate policies, is mutual fund better than individual securities or index trading, or is climate risk information not yet the influential factor in Indian stock market? If I'm not wrong, Professor Nitin, you have done some work in climate finance. Would you like to take this question?
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, whether this information is priced into the markets, right? Is that the question, right? Yeah.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Yeah, so I and my colleague Shashwat and along with Russ Wormers have worked on this area a little bit. And 2 years back, we started working on this, and then the paper came out recently in the Review of Financial Studies. So we find that, even professional investors do not rationally react to these big events. So we have an experimental design, and we show that, without going into the details here, that even truly professional investors, such as the big mutual funds in US, they tend to overreact to these big disaster events. So it is an important question how to quantify the risk of these big climate events, and a lot of work is going on. This is a work in process, I would say.
Thank you, Professor. Moving on, second question that we have is, it's a very brief question. It says, generally, there is a self-fulfilling prophecy theory in markets. How are anomalies explained in this context?
I can take a shot at that. Okay. So it is true that for some time, self-fulfilling prophecies can fuel some anomalies for some time, right? So thinking about a stock market bubble, right? And some investors, so for example, think that these are very good stocks. They buy into them, the stock price goes up, and other investors kind of want to jump on it, and that fuels the price even further. Okay, so this can go on for a while, but at some point, the true information, so to speak, comes on. Okay? And this is where it is important to understand why a certain anomaly is working or not working. Okay. Investor biases in some places that feed into these anomalies can make it a self-fulfilling prophecy for some time. And then it kind of depends upon your horizon whether you want to trade against the anomaly as to exploit it in the long term, or you want to jump on the bandwagon and take advantage of the self-fulfilling prophecy in the short term.
Anand, I just want to add quickly. Dr. Tirthankar spoke about that Jacobs paper. People just don't pick up a time frame in sample and show that this works. What they typically do, they test out of sample. And nowadays, people have started doing international as well. So anomaly discovered in the US working in India, right? So they're careful. That's what we have been telling right from beginning. This is not some cooked up data mining exercise. People are very careful to make sure that this is not just data mining.
Thank you, Prasanna. One question that we had was, how do we go about, for example, let's say I've gone through a research paper, I have read a strategy, and the paper says that it works. Now, as a layman, how do I go on to implement that strategy? What are the steps that I need to take to implement that strategy?
Okay, I can take a stab at it. So one of the most common strategies is the trend following strategy, or as the academic literature calls it, as the momentum strategy. So a couple of years back, when I was teaching the portfolio management course in Mohali, so one student after the course said that, look, I'm interested in this area. I want to learn more about it. So fortunately, we have the Bloomberg terminals at the lab, and I told him how to go about it. He extracted the data, back tested it, and so on. So what he found that momentum works in the Indian markets very well. Now, coming specifically, so that is about the learning part of it. If you have access to professional data and so on. Now, on the implementation part. Look, some simple strategies can be applied using open source data. For instance, the momentum, for instance. There are a lot of websites which gives you past 12 months of return, past 6 months returns, and so on. Then you just have to sort the stocks based on those returns, and you can take a long position in the winner stocks. So some of them can be applied using open source data.
So can I pitch in, Anand, just for a second?
Of course, of course.
So adding to what Nitin was saying, so there is lots of stuff that comes out of academic research where the data requirements are not so onerous. For example, where you don't need to take or real-time data. For example, if you have a few trading strategies that do come out based on past balance sheet, past income statement data, which is basically you can get from Google. Okay, so the important thing is, of course, you won't be able to do what Goldman Sachs
can. Can you give a quick example?
Sure, Prasanna. So there is this old paper, 20-year-old paper by an academic called Piotrowski. Now, Piotrowski actually did a very simple thing. He said, okay, we note that value stocks outperform growth stocks, simply saying high book-to-market ratio stocks outperform book-to-market stocks. He said, can I refine it further? And he found that he could refine this further by a very simple sort of classification of these stocks into simple ratios, which, I mean, anybody in the finance world would easily relate to. Things like profitability, things like liquidity, things like debt to equity ratio, things like operating efficiency. Very, very simple things which we all talk about on a daily basis. So he essentially assigned a score on each of these dimensions. He picked 9 of them and added them up. This is like the most no-frills academic paper one can observe. Of course, he chose a large amount of data and was very careful. But my point is the classification itself is very simple. I could sit at my home and do this. And mind you, this doesn't need any real-time data. And the punchline is, of course, in Piotrowski's paper that further treatment using this well-known and already observed character space, and that's an anomaly, by the way, makes money hand over fist compared to either a benchmark index or a straightforward high book to market strategy. And practitioners naturally have caught on to this. There is, if you Google Piotrowski, Piotroski F score, I mean, look at the number of things, non-academic sites you will pull up. I mean, this is for the audience. So stuff like that can be done at home, Anand, is what I'm trying to answer. So, yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Definitely, sir. I think I used Piotrowski, or I tried replicating it while I was a student over here. And as you said, it's quite simple to do. Moving on.
Anand,
yes,
there's one question here that I
please
want to take.
Please go ahead.
Even though Prasanna kind of answered it in one way. So the question is, most of trading strategies published in research paper do not work in real world or real market. And this is a statement, not a question. So I will add my own question, that is it true? Okay. So there are two aspects to it. First is that whether it worked during the period of that study. Okay, and this is what Prasanna and I and we all talked about. The rigor of academic research is designed to make sure that those results are not by fluke. Okay. Now the second question is, do they work after it becomes widely known? Okay. And Tirthankar in his beginning remark sort of mentioned a study in the US that once these papers are published, then slowly the effect starts going away. Okay. But there is a more recent paper published in 2020 looking at this phenomena globally. Jacobs and Muller, Tirthankar also referred to this. They show that only in the US this effect goes away and not in other markets internationally. Okay. And the reason is related to Nitin's earlier point about competition. Okay. Lot more capital and hence competition is applied to exploiting the strategies in the US, which is not the case in other markets, certainly not the case in India. Okay. So a priori, there is much more room to making returns on these strategies in the Indian context.
One more question, maybe, Anand.
Yeah, I have a last question. Thank you, Professor Prati. And I think this last question is directly related to the Jacobs and Muller paper that we were just talking about. The question is, paper by Linenma and Roberts published in 2019 says that anomalies are an in-sample phenomena and is working due to data snooping. What is your take on this?
So I can take it. So that's what Jacob and Muller do. So if it is data snooping, see, there is pre-sample, in-sample, out-of-sample, post-publication. So pre-sample is the period before they used. So in-sample is the sample period that they have used. So what these Jacobs and Muller do, they take up all these anomalies and test which are those anomalies which work out of sample. So these are not the sample period that those researchers have used. Nobody doubts here that in the sample period that they've used, these strategies work. They're very rigorous. So they go out of sample and show that these things work, and not only out of sample, they go out of country. They go out of US and show they work. So it's not just data snooping. That's what I'm saying. So people do take care. Of course, some strategies have been shown that these are data snooping, and the fact that it works post publication is a vindication of the strategy. It doesn't show that it's a data snooping exercise. That means people have followed this strategy. So if it was just risk or some data snooping, why would anybody invest based on that strategy? It means people. So the beauty is these strategies work post sample, pre-publication. That means this is right out of sample, but post publication they stop working in the US. That means once people know about it, they use them, and that's what they don't work. So this is not just data. At least many of them are not data snooping exercises. Anyone wants to add anything?
Last point, again emphasizing Ramana's original point, and this is where knowing why the strategy is working is a good guard, good check against any possibility of data snooping or random chance.
Yeah, and what Prasanna just said is a beautiful statement. He's talking about the great paradox of the efficiency of the market. The harder you try to uncover anomalies, the fewer they will exist eventually. And that's an important lesson. Thanks, Prasanna, for putting it very nicely.
I think we can end there. This is not just this whole talk, this webinar is not just about making money. Actually, too many anomalies should not exist, because eventually markets are not textbook kind of efficient, but we need some kind of efficiency to bring down cost of capital. There are real implications to real investors. If the entire market, every kind of anomaly works, the cost of capital is going to be crazy. So there is merit in people using it even from a societal point of view. So that's another key takeaway of discussion on anomalies. So with that, I thank all three participants and also NSE for providing this opportunity to set up this lab and doing all these kind of interesting research. Our endeavor will be to come out with some kind of practitioner kind of work at least over the next year or so, where we make these anomalies or research in general accessible to non-academics as well. So that's it. Anand, do you have anything else to add?
Prasanna, would you like to take a minute and talk about the upcoming policy conclave that we are planning next month?
January 15th, our second conclave will be in January 15th. We will be talking about how, again, this will be practitioners. This time it was academics. There you will have practitioners. And we will also, there will be a session where we will show how research that has come out of ISB on the support of the lab is useful to create an index. So we are going to start tracking some of these things. Again, coming out of research. So request you all to join us on January 15th. We'll send a communication. Thanks once again to all the participants and NSE also. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Prasanna. Thank you, Prachi. Thank you, Nitin. And thank you, Professor Ramanna. Truly, thank you, Anand, of course. I mean, this has been exhilarating. I wish we had more of these, and one can only say encore, truly. I mean, so we look forward to the next edition of such webinars. I mean, this has been a truly interesting and very lively evening, and thank you all for this. Thank you. Thanks a lot.